Sometime last year, I was writing about Silent Hill 2, and I found myself asking, damn, why all the moth and butterfly motifs? And one misspelled internet search later, and I was writing about incest. Now, it's time to write about insects, and specifically, why are women associated with insects in horror? Today we're going to look at 6 examples of women in horror whose stories see heavy associations with insects. I'm going to keep this as spoiler-free as possible, but if you get to a section on a character and you don't want to risk seeing any of their story beats spoiled, just skip to the next bit. So there's no sponsor for today's video, but I do have a quick announcement before we begin. Earlier this year, I was approached by Andrew of Cairo Games to work on his debut Steam project, Soul Chained. Soul Chained is a fantastically fun co-op game with some silly Souls-inspired combat elements, focusing on the story of 2 fallen rival warlords whose souls have been chained together for all eternity. Condemned to wander purgatory, you must atone for your mortal sins, while bound to the very people you once called enemies. It's all swords and shields and stamina management, but with the added fun of having a chain connecting you that you can use to trip enemies over and grief NPCs. The game features equal opportunity jiggle physics, which I know some of you will appreciate, and will be released later this month. I feature as your purgatorial guide, leading your way up the mountain of sin. It's my job to try to make you see what absolute terrors you've been back on Earth. This was my first time doing voice work, and I really enjoyed it. Andrew was really nice to work with, I learned a lot, and I might be biased here, but I think the game is great and that you should give it a shot. I will make another post when the game releases, but for now, check it out on Steam, add it to the wishlist, and try the demo. Thank you for listening, let's get on with the video. The fear of bugs, or entomophobia, is a fear most of us know. The idea of one of those big fat centipedes skittering over your legs while you sleep is enough to give anyone the heebie-jeebies. When a beetle takes flight, so do I. They're called creepy crawlies for a reason, and not to get too technical this early in the morning, but that reason is likely driven by a series of emotional, cognitive, and behavioral traits that evolved within the human race to avoid infectious diseases, rendering it one of the most universal fears of the Anthropocene. Basically, being scared of bugs is normal. But when did we start associating them with women? Well, there's a long answer and a short answer, and I've quite enjoyed researching the long answer, so we are going to begin our examination in the most unlikely of places, late Victorian Gothic literature, specifically a genre known as eco-Gothic, where horror meets filth, fungus, and bugs. This pulpy cocktail creates a fictional environment that rises up to challenge the dominance of humanity by walking right through the boundaries and barriers we have spent so long setting in place. We imagine the human body as a closed system, just as our forefathers imagined the Empire as a closed system, and eco-Gothic horror is, and was, all about learning just how vulnerable both systems really are to infection and corruption. The final years of the Victorian era saw the people of England worry a lot about their continued relevance on the global stage, and this fear surfaced in 4 ways. The fear of the other, the fear of Darwinian degeneration and subsequent return to animality, the fear of desecration of established boundaries, and the fear of the civilized world being overrun by primitive forces. For the sake of keeping this video efficient, please assume that I am doing wild and exaggerated quotation marks whenever I reference the racist evil of my forebears. I don't want to have to asterisk every dodgy comment with "I don't endorse this, I'm just quoting it," because we will be here forever otherwise. Please assume what I'm saying is in good faith, and please just kind of have faith in me to be making a broader point. The way that racism works is by biologizing the threshold between human and animal as a division internal to humanity. Essentially, divide humanity into groups that are more human or more animal on the basis of an arbitrary set of rules, and treat each half of the divide accordingly. All white people were considered human since English people manufactured the sliding scale, and people of colour were treated like animals. Great Britain colonised a lot of the world on the justification of assumed racial superiority, and then became absolutely terrified of it happening back to them. Racial superiority is an incredibly subjective justification for enslavement, murder, pillaging, and in the deepest nightmares of the English, all it would realistically take for them to suffer the fate they had been subjecting everybody else to would be an enemy with the right resources to do it. An enemy that can outwit, outman, and outgrow. To make my point, we are going to look at 2 stories stories from the late Victorian period, Bram Stoker's Dracula and Richard Marsh's The Beetle, which were published in the same year and both depict themes of colonization and corruption by an unforeseen superior outside force to kind of demonstrate to you where the fears of bugs and women as bugs began to surface. And then we'll jump to the present day. Dracula is a pretty white book. In fact, the predominant whiteness of the Victorian novel world and of Victorian characters is taken for granted. Despite every character in the book being white, it's never mentioned that a character is white unless it's important, because white equals default in Dracula, except for Dracula, who is also white, but he is exceptionally white. Bram Stoker was born in Ireland, which had been colonised by Great Britain in the 12th century. The thing is, the people of Ireland are ethnically white, so what was Britain's justification there? The only way it was possible to claim racial superiority would be to insist that there are further levels to skin colour and lineage that, surprise surprise, we invented and benefited from. Growing up in England, Stoker doubtlessly witnessed the incredible double standards of the English people and their attitudes to race and whiteness, particularly when it came to the treatment of his own people. Because, referring back to the human-animal racism divide I mentioned earlier, we did not treat the Irish very well. Stoker was born in 1847 during the worst year of the potato famine, which became known as Black 47. The potato famine was a period of mass starvation caused by a blight that infected potatoes across Europe. When this blight hit Ireland, it reduced the population of the country from 8.4 million to 4.4 million. This preventable famine was exacerbated by the British government, who didn't only fail to help the Irish, but actually actively continued to siphon food and resources out of the country, knowingly worsening the situation. Many members of the British government believed that the famine was divine judgment and the Irish lacked moral character. It's not explicitly word for word stated anywhere as to whether Stoker himself was critical of Britain. If he did say anything explicit, it's not reached us here in 2026, but his fiction is deeply critical of British colonial sentiment in ways that cloak themselves in satire and metaphor. Stoker's other novel, The Jewel of Seven Stars, focused on the story of Queen Terror, a mummy that gets exhumed by British archaeologist Professor Abel Trelawney to be unwrapped and resurrected. It betrayed the monstrosity of the English and exhibits a pessimism about the future of British society and empire. It is an incredibly anti-colonial read, and Dracula is no different. Scholars have debated Dracula's ethnicity for years. Jack Halberstam thinks that he represents that era's fears around Jewish people, and Rafaela Dolores Gomez argues that Dracula represents a whirlpool of Eastern European races, but Grace Monaghan argues that Dracula represents the monstrosity from within whiteness itself, and I'm kind of inclined to agree with her. Dracula is white. He exhibits an extraordinary pallor, white teeth, white hands, a white moustache, a deathly pale complexion, a livid white face. His presence is signified by atmospheric whiteness, white powdery snow, white mist, violent white storms, white crested waves, white ghostly clouds, and white foam. And most notably, Dracula is whiter than us. He's like one echelon of white up, he's corpse white, and if white is superior, then Mr. Sensodyne was justified, nay, obliged, to colonize us, and he did this by going for the women. There are two female characters in Dracula called Mina and Lucy, both of which fall to Dracula's seductive spell, and these moments are full of interesting subtext. When Dracula hypnotizes Lucy, the moment takes on a tone of sexual assault, and her resulting actions are called immoral sexuality, i.e. despite being controlled by an ancient and powerful creature, she is still judged for what she does whilst under Dracula's spell. Lucy is compared to Whitby's White Lady legend, her whiteness being the defining factor of the horror she represents. Her white laundress, a dress that is initially so beautiful that it draws men to sit around her like pigeons on a chip shop roof, becomes a death robe. Her gums shrink back, giving the appearance of a dog baring its teeth, dividing human and animal. More importantly, Lucy targets children, who represent England's racial future. Her anti-maternal activities violate the prescribed role for white women as moral safeguard, responsible for protecting against racial contamination. The idea being that if a woman is corrupted by an outside influence, then so is her womb, and therefore so are her children, and consequently the future of the country itself becomes corrupted. Mina's transformation is similarly coded as sexual assault. When Dracula comes to her, he forces her to drink his blood directly from his breast, while her husband, Jonathan Harker, sleeps next to them, inert and impotent. Nowadays, impotent means either the original broader definition of useless and inert, or the newer sexual definition of thumbing rope, erectile dysfunction, etc., and I couldn't find a source to suggest whether impotent meant the latter by 1897, but it's an interesting choice of word regardless, considering the layout of this scene and what exactly is occurring. The Gothic man, a microcosm of colonial masculinity, feared helplessness more than anything, to the point where much of the horror of Dracula feels like it borders on the horror of non-consensual cuckoldry and the infidelity of a wanton woman who lures you in by pretending to be pure and incorruptible, only to be out sharing fluids with foreign men. Mina's desire for Dracula, or her unwillingness to resist him, renders white masculinity all the more powerless. Mina has a child, and the child represents a threat to the nation, both because he contaminates England's racial purity and because he allows Dracula to linger on. The thing about Victorian England is that it oppressed women, but also considered them to be the foundation of society. Women acted as the boundary markers of empire, controlling women's sexuality, exalting maternity, and breeding a race of white empire builders was paramount for controlling the health and wealth of the male imperial body politic. There were increasingly vigilant efforts to control women's bodies, and these efforts were suffused with acute anxiety about the desecration of sexual boundaries and the consequences of racial contamination. Essentially, Dracula's attacks on women threaten the nation as a whole. Dracula corrupts the normative, pure whiteness of the women he attacks, and through this infiltrates the racial purity of a nation that has based everything on said racial purity, and begins the process of reverse colonization. As Monaghan concludes, Stoker's novel reveals that whiteness and animality, which together compromise the threat of degeneration, are not exterior to the empire, as England would like to believe, but decidedly interior. So with Dracula, we have our first three major stepping stones towards women as insects: women as corruptible, women as animal, and the fear of reverse colonization. The Beetle, or The Beetle, a Mystery, was a book that initially outsold Dracula because it was based on the fears of a real phenomenon, the invasion of the Colorado potato beetle, which was a threat so potent to British people that it began to appear in Christmas pantomimes. For my non-British viewers, that is a really big deal. It is such a big deal that I asked my American co-writer Adam Washington for a comparison that I could use for my American audience, and he said, "Say like if the Hamburglar was a beetle." And I said, "Are you sure? Might it not be condescending to suggest that the American equivalent of pantomime is the McDonald's ensemble?" And he said it's fine, so please take it up with him. The beetle was so threatening that it was regarded as more human than any other opposing nation on Earth. We were terrified of it. Sir Wilfrid Lawson, a Liberal Party politician, said an invasion from the Colorado beetle was more to be feared than an invasion from Germany or France. And in 1877, The Spectator referred to beetles as members of a dangerous race. The beetle was compared to the Bashibazouks, which were mercenary soldiers in the Ottoman army, implying the beetle to be foreign, invasive, evil, and racially other. An 1877 Funny Folks parody piece included the quote, "We recognise him in the pioneer of an army who will soon attempt to ravage our fields, bring desolation to our hearths, and comport itself generally like a conquering force in a subjugated country," depicting the beetle as a colonial power. In essence, the Colorado beetle threatened to do to England what England had been doing to the rest of the world for the entirety of the 19th century and earlier. Since beetles arrived through trade with the empire, the horror came from its potential to destroy the empire and use the empire's technology against it. And all the more ironic that said beetle targeted potatoes. Not so funny when it happens to you, is it? In the beetle, the titular beetle is Egyptian. Britons, like the Romans before them, had a weird condescending respect for Egypt. The country was politically represented as a blushing maiden or an alluring ancient temptress, but only the ancient Egyptians. Present-day Egyptians, like, say, the beetle, were despised as the fallen offspring of their pharaonic forebears, but the Egyptian of the Jewel of Seven Stars, Queen Terra, is a well-preserved example of the revered ancient Egyptian leaders. Essentially, the English saw present-day Egyptians as dirty and foreign international threats to their racial purity, but their ancestors as proud, equally Caucasian peers. The beetle is a character that represents all manner of non-white, non-male, non-British things. The beetle is referred to as an Arab, an Algerian, an Egypto-Arabian, a queer foreign away, and a dirty foreigner who went around in a bedgown through the public streets. Although the beetle is referred to as a priestess of Isis and a woman of the songs, the narration does not make their gender clear and uses a variety of pronouns to refer to them, drawing a striking parallel with the actual characters of the book, who all insist on categorizing the beetle under a set gender, even when the beetle physically shapeshifts between sexes in front of them. Beetles were objects of beauty and fashion, and parasites and pests. As more people left the countryside in the years 1801 to 1911, they showed an increasing propensity to collect bugs, to place beetles and butterflies under glass, much the same way that women were owned and possessed as status symbols with very little agency of their own. The beetle represents the uncanny, the disorder, the alien that the Gothic appears to express, but in fact seeks to control, in much the same way as its women. The beetle performs mysterious rites and orgies of nameless horror, which involve immolating white British women and sustaining themselves on the ashes. The beetle steals gender and definition. Their house is empty, except for Marjorie's clothes and her hair, which appear to have been ripped out by the roots. This is part of the beetle's plan to disguise Marjorie as a lower-class vagrant man, so basically she kills and eats women, at least at first. The beetle is also incredibly sexually aggressive. Sexual aggression plays a huge role in colonial fiction, be it on the allegorical end of things, like in Jewel of Seven Stars, where Stoker points fingers at British entitlements towards foreign women in a scene where Queen Terra's body is unwrapped. Trelawney's daughter Margaret begs her father not to unwrap a body of a woman in front of a crowd of men, and her father responds, "Not a woman, dear, a mummy," thus reversing the trope of the foreign, racially othered man sexually assaulting a white woman, demonstrating Britain's hypocrisies back to them. In The Beetle accosts homeless man Holt in a series of sexually charged attacks, and then hypnotizes him and uses him to help destroy Paul Lessingham, the object of their vengeful vendetta. The Beetle hysterically claims the white British man as their slave and familiar spirit, tying him to Satanism without his consent, which would have been a jaw-dropper back then. As Monaghan explains, the disturbing nature of the sexual attacks come from the implications of homosexuality inherent in them. Since Britain at the time was extremely homophobic, sexual acts between men had been outlawed since the 16th century and were punishable by death, and Queen Victoria tightened this law to include oral sex in 1885. The Beetle calls to Paul Lessingham in an impassioned, frenzied manner, which he regards as an expression of homoerotic desire. He has all the qualities of the ideal British man, qualities the Beetle envies and lusts after. The Beetle's crimes are depicted as sexually executed but racially motivated, as if their Egyptian hatred of white skin masks a frustrated longing to possess a white body. Hypnotizing men into becoming helpless victims, much the same way that Dracula hypnotized Mina and Lucy, inspires that fear of impotence and emasculation that we see so frequently in Gothic literature, and demonstrates to us that there was little scarier to the men of Britain than finding out that they can be sexually assaulted in the same way that the British were sexually assaulting colonised women. An 1877 Punch cartoon depicts a woman in an elaborate dress that resembles, from the back, the Colorado beetle. The below caption reads, "No mistake this time," referencing an investigation into an alleged Colorado beetle sighting that turned out to be a ladybird. The association with women and bugs began surprisingly early, this beautiful creature hiding a hidden, empire-destroying corruption. So with the Beetle, we now have women associated with Egyptian priestesses associated with beetles, and beetles associated with reverse colonization. That was a big foundation to set for a video like this, but it was important to understand. Dracula reflects England's concerns about the moral validity of imperial expansion. England colonized a significant portion of the world because it considered itself to be racially superior, with white at the top of the pyramid. But Dracula asks, what if there was a whiter white, a higher superior that we hadn't accounted for? Would we deserve to be colonized then, under our own logic? All in all, Dracula represents a nightmare of the logic of imperialism. Through the work of Bram Stoker, we can see the intense fear that the people of Victorian England felt about being colonized by something superior to them, by the metrics they themselves had invented. This something was initially depicted as Dracula, who was super white, and would just walk past all of our barriers to entry by moving as mist and foam and storms, then corrupt Victorian women, and then destroy Victorian society from within. Through the Beetle, we see the intense fear the people of England had towards the Colorado beetle, which proved to be a far more insidious threat to the stability of the empire than any other human population. Beetles had greater numbers, more devastating consequences, and it didn't need to wage a war to set foot on English soil. All it needed to do was smuggle itself onto one ship, and we were done for. Women were considered the heart of purity in this imperial nation. Incorruptible baby makers, who, as long as they maintained purity, would continue to push out great male empire builders. If women fell to the foreign threat, then Great Britain was finished. Because if you build an empire on the justification of racial superiority, that is your one benchmark for deserving to keep it. Women incubating corruption or becoming corrupted themselves became a real fear in the colonial world. If you enjoy box office flops with bad writing, I recommend the 2006 movie Slither. I really liked this movie, and I thought everyone did until I showed it to my friends and they absolutely hated it. Focused on the story of an invasive alien species arriving on Earth and approaching copulation with the biblical zest of a Magaluf stag party, Slither is a campy and surprisingly light-hearted take on the terrifying prospect of small-town white Americans being used as a living, breeding farm for an uncaring foreign species. And do you see now why all that Dracula discussion was important? From the first moment to the last, Slither is crammed full of depictions of sex, sexual assault, and reproduction. The meteor that brings the alien worm to Earth crash lands on a thick forest floor and cracks open to reveal its wet, gory interior, reminiscent of an egg. The story itself opens on a teaching scene, which is film shorthand for "this is the central theme, so pay attention," where main character Starla Grant explains Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest and how humans only think they have ecological dominance. Starla and her husband Grant, yes, his name is Grant Grant, have an ailing sex life. Grant married Starla because she's beautiful and he wants a trophy wife that he can control, and Starla picked Grant because she grew up in poverty under negligent parents and saw Grant's offer of escape as her only option. Sex between them is occasional and awkward, and they seem to like different things. Like, he wants to rough her up and jump into bed cold, off the back of a long day of work and with minimal foreplay and while her hair is in curlers, and she's not really that physically into him. Grant, tired of rejection, goes to drink at the local bar where he meets the doe-eyed Brenda Gutierrez, a girl who admits she's always had a thing for him. After a flirtatious back and forth, we cut to them fooling around in the forest, blind drunk. When Brenda kisses Grant, he stops, pushes her away, and tries to leave. As he does so, he sees the weird egg that fell in the forest, and the pair follow it to find a glistening, wet, chode-shaped pupa on the floor with a vagina-shaped opening. The pupa jettisons a barb into Grant's belly, which worms its way up into his brain in an allegorical parallel to sexual assault. He is being penetrated in a painful, non-consensual way. His body, his closed system, is not invulnerable to the corruption of a dominating outside force. At this point, the barb appears to be piloting Grant. He looks around at the world as though through fresh eyes, like he's never seen it before. He communicates in simple words and grunts, and he eats raw meat fresh out of the fridge, indicating this foreign corruption Grant. But To what end? Well, Starla is willing to have sex again, but Grant resists impregnating her the alien way because he loves her. In a decision that you could write an entire book about, Grant curbs his urge to turn his beautiful blonde trophy wife into a human nest by taking out his impulses on Brenda, a poor and messily presented woman living with her, as Grant says, half-Mexican partner in a trailer park. Brenda is a cheater, and so within the narrative she is fair game for a punishment that even the Greek gods wouldn't have thought of. You could call it Brenda is the flesh. Grant shows up at Brenda's house where she is ready with a seductive plate of cheese and crackers. He reveals 2 penis tentacles in his chest, and then he falls on her in a rape scene that ended up being way more visceral than I remember it was when I watched this 20 years ago. Silly country music only slightly takes the edge off the horror of this scene. Grant pumps her full of millions of alien seeds that quickly begin to grow, ushering Brenda into a hideously exaggerated state of pregnancy. The next we see of Brenda, she is chained up in a remote farmhouse with a massive baby belly. She is the kind of starving you couldn't even imagine, the kind of starving that even makes rotten raw meat look palatable. She's so hungry that she thinks she's going to die, so she eats and eats and eats until she is the size of a balloon. Brenda's state is a campy exaggeration of the suffering of pregnancy, the cravings, the hunger, the size, and the shame of her size, which we see when she mournfully admits that she never wanted anyone to see her like this. Her massive naked body lurches under the force of her wormy brood's kicks and contractions, and when they begin to tear her open, reminiscent of the way that the gooch can occasionally tear open during childbirth, she lashes out in pain, calling a police officer a bitch. Brenda explodes and worms pour out onto the floor. The alien worm is a foreign invader that begins an aggressive colonization. They leap into open mouths, dig up into the brain, and then latch on. When they make contact, the victim absorbs an entire history's worth of information, seeing the way this outbreak happened on multiple planets, destroying multiple civilizations. A cultural rewriting and forced assimilation in line with historical colonial efforts, only happening over a matter of seconds, not days, weeks, or years. Brenda's role as the hive, or the womb, is an instrumental but sacrificial role for her to play in the coming dawn, and it's tragic because she is the expendable woman, who is used as a tool so that the attractive trophy wife isn't wasted in the process, a scathing parody of surrogacy. She is the poor woman, the one with less to lose materially, the one who's already had a child, unlike Starla, who is sexless and childless in a way that makes her almost religiously virginal. Brenda is less attractive, less loyal, and dirty in the sense that she is trawling bars for men to shag with a man of her own at home, while Starla lies in a satin king bed with her hair in curlers. The interesting thing about this is that Starla is depicted to be the ideal mate. Not only is she beautiful and classy on her own, young, blonde and smart, but during her lesson scene her students draw her naked with large breasts and wide hips. The camera also frequently frames her bottom to illustrate the way that other characters ogle and sexualize her, but this does not happen for Brenda. Despite this, and maybe even because of this, Starla is spared her role as mother, and her and Grant's alien surrogacy is instead palmed off on a lower class woman instead. There are 3 ways that pregnancy is explored in film: the association of female bodies with houses or domestic spaces, the designation of woman as vessel within religious horror, and the presentation of a woman as a literal or metaphorical environment within eco-horror. These associations all work within the context of the hive, where a woman is forcefully made the incubator of a foreign entity that may not even know she exists, outside of the limited sentience of an insect. And this works especially well within a religious context. The woman as subject and the fetus as subject do not happily coexist or conjoin. Instead, they struggle for dominance. Other rape for a greater plan fiction, like Rosemary's Baby, highlights the way that not only does the mother end up in a tug of war for relevance with the fetus, often a fight over who deserves their literal life and autonomy, but especially in the instance of the hive, the mother loses because she carries something far stronger than her, whose plans have been marinating for a long time. In the case of Brenda Gutierrez, she dies in childbirth, bursting from the pressure of her many children. Brenda is the most extreme example of woman as hive because her role within the story is to be a living incubator. Once she has served her purpose, she's dead. The connotations of having your body be used as a vessel or incubator for a higher power, like the Virgin Mary, is clear. The woman as hive trope is all about subverting the concept of motherhood, but also pointing a finger at how motherhood can lead to a loss of bodily autonomy. The mother becomes a place, a domestic nest, a house. Insect horror traps women within the domestic sphere by turning their bodies into homes for millions of uncaring creatures, and objectifying them within the domestic world. And the worms in Slither might be aliens, sure, but they're still worms, so, you know, it counts. Starmer's lecture on our misinformed assumption of ecological dominance becomes relevant with our next subject, Marguerite Baker, from Resident Evil 7. So we talked a lot about colonial history and supposedly racial superiority in the introduction to this video, and something that I've found very interesting about being raised in England is the way that we find the oddest similarities with similar ex-imperial forces. For instance, Japan and England don't have much in common, but one major similarity we do share is this history of racially justified colonization. The influence of the Western idea of race was huge in Japan. They developed their own new form of racialization and race categories within the country to protect its national sovereignty and to justify its invasion and discrimination to other Asian populations under imperialism. Consequently, I think that Japanese writers tend to see and write bugs in similar ways to the way English writers do. Just off the top of my head, we have the manga Manhole, which sees a parasitic worm use and abuse human hosts. We have the 1968 film Genocide, or The War of the Insects, where insects rebel against humanity and attempt to overthrow it. We also have a kind of earthly colonization in Junji Ito's Gyo, and while it is a colonization done by sea life, they support themselves on mechanical structures that resemble beetles. Despite being on opposite sides of the planet, Japan likewise uses this trope to explore racial animus and anxieties around corruption by inferior beings infiltrating and overcoming them. Which brings us to Resident Evil 7, a Japanese written game set in the swamps of Louisiana in the United States, and most of the story takes place on Baker grounds, which comprises 3 massive houses, a huge barn, a mobile home, and another building, a greenhouse that could easily sleep 16 more people. I guess real estate is quite cheap on the bayou. Curiously, Resident Evil 8 Village is the installment known as being the moment Resident Evil pivoted towards Gothic horror, being that it screams it from the rooftops and oozes it from its pores, but I would argue that Gothic horror became central to Resident Evil's narrative with 7, not 8. The series' shift towards survival horror saw a parallel shift to stories of domestic horror, beginning with the Baker family and their house, and then the matriarchal dynasty of Resident Evil Village headed by Mother Miranda, a woman who reproduces asexually, but I'm still working on that video, so you'll have to wait. This movement into domestic horror naturally shifted the horror of Resident Evil in a Gothic direction. Survival horror games exploit anxieties surrounding uncanny motherhood to produce feelings of dread, and use the process and spectacle of reproduction, gestation, and childbirth as the locus of player fear, which is an incredibly Gothic horror trope, think Frankenstein. Resident Evil 7 is all about mummies and daddies and making a family through asexual reproductive means within a sprawling southern Gothic-style house, which is as on the nose as you can get. But also, the haunted or cursed house is a prominent setting in Gothic literature. It serves to reinforce the idea that the space of the contemporary house is always already fraught, and its boundaries, like those of the body, are far from fixed. The house may be monstrous or contain, or hide, monsters in plain sight, drawing on this idea of family tensions and secrets that manifest as monsters. The mold below the Baker house is the physical manifestation of simmering strife brought about by the adoption of the antagonist Evelyn, whose innate drive to build a family destroys the lives, minds, and bodies of the once happy Baker home and rots their sprawling property from within. The haunted house trope may sit the traditional family unit as both victims and causes of supernatural trauma, and the bad house may also act as an extension of the minds, fears, or personalities of those who live within it. The Haunting of Hill House is a great example of this, but in short, you don't need a castle for Gothic horror, and Resident Evil 7 is proof of that. A beautiful southern Gothic Gothic house, now loaded with mold and slime and dead silence, with enemies hiding around every corner, family members cordoned off into different sections of the home, and a dinner table covered in rotting meat, will do the trick. Marguerite Baker is the matriarch of the Baker family in Louisiana, and is encountered as an antagonist in the first half of Resident Evil 7 and some of the DLCs, during which her body goes through severe changes in line with her transformation into a living hive. She mutates into a maternal monstrosity, her limbs elongate under her bloodied white dress, and her vulva becomes a bulging hive of flesh and sinew from which her children can spawn. In a subversive parody of the nurturing mother, she begins to feed her family human flesh and fertilizes her garden with the leftovers from their cannibal feasts. The eco-Gothic mother's reproductive power is often the result of infection, contamination, or mutation that causes abject transformations, madness, and eventually death at the hands of the protagonist. Curiously, Marguerite is a far less aggressive boss than her husband Jack, who will pursue the player around the whole house. Marguerite goes to great lengths to hide from Ethan, telling him to leave her alone, running away, and only attacking him when he pursues her. She is the passive maternal to Jack's aggressive paternal. Marguerite Baker and the wider story of Resident Evil 7 is submerged in a genre of fiction coined as eco-Gothic or eco-horror, which are stories predicated upon a relationship between humanity and nature that does not allow for interconnectedness. Having a story based on the corrupting capabilities of evil fungus represents deep-seated anxieties about humanity's boundaries through transformation, hybridity, and invasion, destabilizing the idea of the human as separate from and superior to the greater ecology. Essentially, we are the dominant force in our current ecology, but we are outnumbered and outclassed by entities like fungus and insects, which in the right contexts we would be powerless against. The maternal feminine serves as an envelope, a container, the starting point. Marguerite's mutation turns her into a physical hive with that deliciously papery vulva from which insects sprout. When her mutation evolves, she lumbers around with an exaggeratedly pregnant gait, like when all your weight is on the front of your body and you're trying to balance it out, indicating that the hive is as heavy as a baby. Marguerite's design and function plays on monstrous maternal Gynaehorror and the construction of essential motherhood as innate, as natural as desirable, and the compulsion to conform to the ideal, suggesting that Marguerite's brainwashing has made her incredibly malleable to Evelyn's wishes for a family, and potentially, since she is in her 50s and probably postmenopausal, her channeling of insects is the way her body responded to the mold-induced compulsion to conform. She has become a perfect mother. She's protective, she defends her babies from Ethan, she's nurturing, she feeds them with human flesh, and she's loving. She calls them her babies and her pretties. The ideology of essential motherhood becomes corrupted when pregnancy and the resulting offspring are represented as monstrous. Marguerite is more empowered than Brenda. Her role wasn't to be raped and used as an incubator, but her fungal brainwashing ensured that nothing that has happened with her consent. In fact, in the DLC, you can see her resist the infection just long enough to give Zoe a key so that she might escape and find them help. Jack and Marguerite are tragic figures all in all, and Marguerite especially because her body is twisted, warped, and ruined. She is the incubator for thousands of entities that couldn't care less about her, and her role as family maker is sidelined by Evelyn when she finds a younger, better host to act as the mother of her family. Marguerite is left to wander around the old house, representing her own lack of relevance within a family unit that explicitly prefers the younger Mia, surrounded by old baby dolls, representing the family that Evelyn wants, and perhaps the family that Marguerite sees in her fungal delusions. It was Simone de Beauvoir that said, "Patriarchal society is the one that enables the projection of male fantasies and fears onto the body of the woman," and Marguerite, an old, barren, and unattractive mother whose children are corrupt colonizers, exemplifies that quote in every possible way. We're moving into the middle of the hive to metamorphosis scale now, and I've not thought of a flashier sounding name for this spectrum yet, but I'll get there. You know, catch me towards the end. I'll have something. Next on our list is Jane Prentiss, a woman turned flesh hive and the first major antagonist of fictional horror podcast The Magnus Archives. Jane is notable because she does become a hive, but she exhibits many of the behaviours of the latter half of this scale. Most notably, and just like in The Beetle, Jane colonizes the corruption of women and performs sexually charged attacks of violation and forced pregnancy, which is a kind of behavior that in literature is typically reserved for men. Jane is first introduced to us third hand in episode 6, which is titled Squirm. Squirm is head archivist Jonathan Sims' recital of the statement of a man named Tim Hodge who met a woman named Harriet who was assaulted by Jane Prentiss, rendering the distance between Johnny and Jane quite far. I really enjoy Squirm because it's a story that is ripe with subtext. It features a main character called Tim, who is a freelance designer and the kind of guy who works like non-stop on projects. The only time off he gets is the time that he schedules between projects, where he takes about a week to decompress hard through drinking and clubbing, and often goes out alone. Tim raises a lot of red flags to me. He describes himself as not looking for sex, but alert and open to the possibility. He also insists in the beginning of the statement that he was sober during the events of the statement, but occasionally he will admit that he drank more than he is letting on. Whilst in a nightclub, Tim spies a skinny student-looking woman, anywhere between 19 and 28, and then calls her exactly the kind of girl I'd go for. And for the record, Tim does not list his own age, but a minimum age of 19 is a little bit eye-catching in a statement like this, where we already know that Tim obfuscates details like his own soberness, so as to come off in a better light when telling his version of events. Tim, not looking for sex but open to it, Hodges, spends a lot of time that night trying to catch Harriet's eye and notices that she seems really scared. Harriet is glancing at the door, she's not drinking alcohol, she'll only accept a glass of water, and when he invites her back to his place, he notices and says that she breathed a sigh of relief and says that she doesn't seem excited, just relieved. In a situation where it's really apparent that something bad is happening, you know, maybe she's been spiked, maybe she's been abandoned by her friends, maybe she's been stalked or harassed, maybe it's even a trafficking situation, Tim decides that the best course of action he could possibly take is to take her back to his house, and the entire time he just keeps remarking on how weird and nervous and scared she seems, without really doing anything about it beyond paying lip service or taking her anywhere neutral and safe. Even when Harriet is scratching her arms so hard that she is leaving red welts in the skin, Tim only says, "I started to suspect something was wrong and asked her if there was anything I should know." But Harriet insists on just, let's just get back to your place, and he's like, whatever it is, I'm sure it'll be easier to deal with at my house. And I guess that could be true, but with all of his prior behaviour, it just kind of comes off really sleazy. It feels more like, let's just do whatever it takes to get you back to my house. I was starting to think something was wrong, he says, with the kind of hindsight that you would use to pace your token moments of concern out in retrospect, and act like you weren't completely ignoring the fact that something had been openly wrong from moment one. Once safe in his house, Tim finally asks what's up, and Harriet starts crying, admitting that she has been mugged. Harriet recalls a few nights prior, she encountered a young woman lying face down on the pavement wearing a long red dress, which shifted as though something was moving underneath it. This was, as Harriet would learn, a trap that she falls into by trying to be a good Samaritan. Tim recounts, suddenly, far quicker than Harriet could have expected, the woman leapt to her feet and sprinted directly towards her, seizing her by the shoulders and pushing her back against a nearby wall. She tried to ask what the mugger wanted, but as she did, she felt a sudden pain in her stomach, as though she'd been stabbed, which is exactly what she thought had happened. Obviously, this attack of Jane Prentiss on Harriet mimics sexual assault. We have a violent penetration, and as we learn, an impregnation. Harriet recounts that there was no trace of injury, mimicking the way that rape can often fail to leave external injuries. She recounts that her knees were scraped up, representing the bruised knees of a sexual encounter. Harriet says that she sees the woman everywhere she goes, representing PTSD. Her skin was really itchy, mimicking the way that abuse victims often feel the need to clean themselves obsessively following an encounter. And when she tried to go to the police, she was overcome by such a powerful nausea that she threw up in the street, which again connects to PTSD, reliving the horror, having to retell your story. She said that whenever she was at home by herself, she felt a weight pulling her down, which is likely the mental manipulation of the worm infestation inside her, which is trying to force her to be near people so that it can spread to other hosts. But it also works in a dual sense with the fear of being alone following an attack. Tim Hodge, who is, by the way, the only survivor of this night, Harriet dies as part of this story, claims that Harriet kissed him out of nowhere and insists that he knew that she was vulnerable but he wasn't trying to take advantage, and then allowed her to lead him to the bedroom where they just had sex. The thing is, Harriet was likely driven to do this by the worms, who clearly wanted to spread to other hosts, but at the same time, Tim represents the way that people think taking advantage is something done with strategy and intent, which, I mean, it can be, definitely, but it can also just be a situation of, oh, I've accidentally ignored all of these red flags and maneuvered somebody who may be drugged or in danger or under duress into an isolated situation with me that I can now say yes to and pretend is totally mutual. That's why it's called taking advantage. He's taking advantage of an opportunity that he's kind of manufactured. After they have sex, Harriet ends up giving birth, Brenda Gutierrez style, i.e. exploding into a writhing mass of worms that Tim Hodges soon burns down with the rest of his flat. Destroying the worms, yes, but also any evidence of his wrongdoing. He purges Harriet and his associated guilt with fire, not realizing that their sexual intercourse has resulted in him becoming infected himself. We see Tim Hodge again in episode 26 in the husk of an old abandoned pub, and the worms have eaten through his body so thoroughly that the person observing him remarks that his eye sockets are just writhing masses of worms. In this episode, Tim is explicitly called a flesh hive, drawing attention to the way that Harriet and Jane seemed to have varying levels of autonomy whilst corrupted, you know, running around, spreading their seed, but Tim, a man, receives this and essentially becomes an egg sac, an object, subverting the trope of hive entirely. Jane Prentiss engages in a lot of typically masculine sexually charged violence, similar to both Dracula and the Beetle, and it represents the way that she corrupts others through sexual intercourse and reproduction. When she encounters research assistant Martin Blackwood in episode 22, he remarks that she wore a grey overcoat with bare legs below it, mimicking the way that like a stereotypical flasher dresses. When Martin screams at the sight of her, she lets the coat fall to the floor in this sexually aggressive display, performing sexual harassment and violation by exposing herself to an unwitting victim. Only instead of her naked female form, her body has become a trypophobia monstrosity. Jane, typical of the metamorphized characters, acts as a predator, following Martin all the way home and laying rotten siege to his house for almost 2 weeks. Again, mimicking stalkers and harassers. Similar to the way that the Beetle enters English space with the intention of corrupting and using men and consuming women, Jane Prentiss colonizes in a way that is typically only depicted as masculine in media. She is the object and the subject. She is the hive and the predator, the feminine victim and the masculine attacker, at least as these tropes are typically presented in fiction. Jane isn't heard from directly until episode 32, which is titled Hive. Jonathan Sims begins this episode by wearily describing a wasp's nest in Jane's attic, referring, as we learn, to an infiltration of her body, not her actual attic. Jane has likely been infected with parasitic wasps, since the worms are described as short and silvery white with black heads, and these make her whole body itch. The bugs inside her represent her trauma and toxicity, none of which are explored beyond passing remarks, but collectively depict a woman who seeks easy solutions and acts compulsively even when it harms herself and others. As we learn, Jane had severe compulsions, which originated from a comment made by a fellow classmate about how blackheads are holes in your face that rot if you don't clean them out, leading her to develop a habit of compulsively picking her skin, which she would do for hours at a time. Terrified of housing rot, Jane ends up falling to it. And there might be a part of Jane, like the clean freak, terrified of rot version of her, still hiding in there, still lingering and disgusted and afraid. But the Jane that we meet in the present day is so corrupted that she's basically a different person. It's like her entire mind has been rewritten. Her manner of thinking has been totally warped by the wasp's nest in her attic to see what's happening to her as a blessing and a gift and a sacred role, not a colonization of her body by a cruel and uncaring higher power. Jane recounts, "There is a wasp's nest in my attic. It sings that I am beautiful, sings that I am home, that I can be fully consumed by what loves me." Again, the hive motif observes that the woman's body is not just split or displaced, but requisitioned, so that she must necessarily submit and defer to another, international and far more important other. Like a perversion of the Virgin Mary who, in the stories of the Bible, gave up her right to her own body so that she could carry an entity deemed more important than her. Jane, chosen by the corruption, must subdue or sacrifice her physical and psychological sense of self in the knowledge that she must also bear the child of good or ill of all humanity, or, children, multiple. Jane explains that she lives with her landlord in a house that isn't her own. She promises that she will show him what a real parasite can do. But most importantly, it demonstrates that her space, internal and external, isn't hers. She rents access to her home on a monthly basis, and now her body has been taken from her, and she will never have it back again. Her internal and external spaces are owned by something else. The most interesting moment in this episode is when Jane asks whether there was a time before this, i.e. a time before her pregnancy. Like her life is now just one massive, endless liminal space between maternity leave and postnatal psychosis, where she talks about bugs in the same way that having a baby makes you only talk about babies for a while. Jane remarks that she used to perform Wiccan rituals that left her feeling exhausted and proud, but she has new spiritual raptures now, parodying the way that fulfilling hobbies are usually replaced by raising children, which is also fulfilling, but for Jane, this is in a toxic way, soothing her need to be loved by filling her body with millions of entities that consume her. Jane is interesting because she demonstrates that what separates hive and metamorphosis women isn't the physical nature of the change, as there's so much overlap between them, but rather the role of that character within that ecosystem and how much time is spent dedicated to the children versus herself. Jane is obsessed with the unconditional love of the children that are eating her alive from the inside because she believes that she is contributing to something bigger than herself and not being used as an incubator. In The Second Sex, Sue Thornham explains that when constructing gender in society, woman is classified in terms of immanence, which is a position intrinsically bound to passivity, subordination, and control. Simone de Beauvoir would add that transcendence, i.e. achieving true freedom, is largely male. For Jane, her subordination has given her a kind of twisted transcendence, not only because she now no longer needs to worry about affording rent every month and being lonely and not having friends, because now she kind of occupies both extremes of the gender spectrum. She is both the hive and the hunter, the pregnant and the impregnator, the stalker and the subordinate. Women in bug fiction are frequently juxtaposed to predatory instincts, not prey. Jane, a woman whose attacks take on a tone of sexual violence, is most certainly the latter, and yet she is still a hive. Women who are corrupted by this outside influence also see their reproductive systems corrupted. Like poisoning the well, the becoming hive women of fiction find that they are no longer able to produce pure human children, and thus the core of their horror is their objectification. They become incubators. By corrupting a woman and making her a hive, you reduce her to her reproductive value and turn her into, at best, a breeding animal, and at worst, an expendable human incubator, an object. In each expression, the woman as subject and the fetus as subject do not happily coexist or conjoin. Instead, they struggle for dominance. Brenda fails to stem the flow of worms from her massive swollen body, dying in a horrid parody of childbirth. Marguerite only loves the insects that swarm inside her body because she has already lost herself to Evelyn's brainwashing, and Jane Prentiss is in a war of rot that she doesn't even realise she's losing, being eaten from within by an entity that sees her as an expendable, temporary 3D printer for its children, losing lucidity faster than she can find help. As stated in Gynaehorror, the pregnant woman is no longer herself. She becomes a pawn in a cosmic game of good and evil, and her womb, and thus symbolically her whole self, as the container for a life deemed more important than her own. The Hive is easy to spot because it lends itself to a character whose purpose is made clear by external factors. The Hive is an object, something to be used as a vessel for a greater, uncaring power that is likely to discard the individual at the end. The Hive is often on the receiving end of sexual assault, be that allegorical or literal, and produces corruption as a byproduct of a never-ending pregnancy. With our hives unpacked and analysed, it is time to start on our ladybugs. 2015's Bite was a female-centred body horror that I feel scored a little bit too low with critics. Rotten Tomatoes had this movie at 51%, which is a perfectly average score, but I enjoyed Bite way more than I thought I would. It's got a lot of terrible character logic and dumb decisions that even I, as someone who spends a lot of time reminding my listeners that people don't make the best decisions when they're scared, would even struggle to defend. In Bite, Casey is a young woman on the precipice of marrying a man named Jared, but she's got cold feet. The movie begins on her hen do, a girl's trip to Colombia, where she and her friends Kristen and Jill get drunk, dance the night away, and talk her up in the bathroom. This segment of the film is full of bug-related comments and interspersed with footage of crawling spiders and a bathroom cockroach, as the girls say things like, "Don't be nervous, we're harmless," and "I'm getting eaten alive out here." Casey's commitment difficulties are arising because of a few problems. Firstly, Jared's mother is psychopathically controlling, as she's Casey's landlady living in the same building as her. She hovers over the couple to the point where she explicitly forbids them from having sex, forcing them to wait until they're married. This is a fine decision to make off your own back as a couple, but obviously having a mother impose that limitation on you is just bizarre behaviour. Casey is justifiably concerned that they might get married only to discover that they're sexually incompatible and end up trapped in a dry and awkward sex life. She also resents the level of control that Jared permits his mother to have over their relationship, because there's no indication that it will get any better once they're legally bound. His mother is really cruel and she shames Casey for every little thing, even for not having any washing detergent when she gets back from her vacation, and admonishes her for failing to pay certain wedding deposits or organise florists and whatnot. And to her credit, the wedding is a week away, so most of that is probably out the window by this point due to Casey's reluctance to plan, but I think it would be hard for anyone to know whether they actually want to commit to a lifelong agreement with that kind of voice in their ear. As we learn towards the end of the movie, Casey actually does love Jared, but only actually has the peace and quiet necessary to realise this once his mother stops screeching in her face and making her feel inferior. What's more is that Jared is a workaholic who often bails on dates together so that he can go into the office, to the point where I assumed that the movie would reveal that he was having an affair, but he wasn't, often leaving Casey alone, acting as an omen for how married life would probably be. He's also quite selfish and bullheaded, bragging to Casey about how funny it was when he watched his boss rip a guy to pieces for wearing a cheap suit. Flexing the way another man bullies is a deeply icky behaviour. Casey is not a great person either though. And this is totally on her. Casey doesn't want kids, and Jared explicitly, clearly does want kids, and she hasn't told him. In fact, from their interactions, the implication is that she pretends that she wants to have kids and plans to tell him that she doesn't only after they are married, which is obviously an awful and deceptive thing to do to someone. Casey's friends want her to have fun on her hen do, but also urge her to tell Jared the truth, which she is too scared to do. And she needs to, because Jared surprises her with this hideous antique high chair as a wedding gift, made from a horrid dark wood. It looks haunted. This is an awful gift, but it highlights his priorities: baby making, family building, and child rearing. So Casey kinda needs to shit or get off the pot. Casey's cold feet lead her to be flirtatious with a man on holiday, allowing him to kiss her cheek and dance with her, which is bad obviously, I'm not excusing that, but the crux of a later reveal is that her friend Jill filmed the whole thing, including the moment that a barely conscious Casey was dragged into a bathroom and raped by the stranger, so that she could take it back to Jared Jared as evidence of cheating. Casey wakes up on the beach with all of her things stolen, including her engagement ring, which was taken by Jill so that Casey would seem irresponsible, and the implications are clear and cruel. Casey's hen party rape results in a pregnancy that coincides with a bug bite on her thigh under her panty line, i.e. the penetration of her body below her underwear and the infection and impending corruption of an unwanted substance. She doesn't know she's been raped at first, and when she begins to vomit up insect eggs, she and the audience assume that this is why her pregnancy tests are showing positives. The insect bite is changing her body, making her vomit up clear slime whenever she tries to eat food, mimicking morning sickness, which she also seems to have, and giving her a pallid appearance. Dogs become scared of her, and sunlight feels too blinding to look at. Casey's metamorphosis, whilst gross and miserable, begins to bestow her with insect powers, like super hearing. There's a moment where she overhears Jared arguing with his mother, who makes explicitly clear that she hates Casey and wants them to break up, and it sounds like it's happening just outside the door. But when Jared walks away from his mother, it's like 20 seconds of footsteps before he knocks on Casey's door, demonstrating that she can now hear things from across the building. When she cooks dinner for them both, her super hearing makes it impossible to focus on conversation because she can hear his belly rumbling, his lips smacking, and the mush of food between his teeth, almost like a physical metaphor for seeing the flaws in someone you are debating breaking up with, as every problem emphasizes itself. When Casey throws up slime and has to go to bed, Jared just seems annoyed with her. He gets very arsey and passive-aggressive about her sitting on the floor of her bathroom and throwing up, which is tonally strange, and sometimes the scenes feel like they've been written and filmed separately, even though they clearly weren't. Jared goes to leave, but they kiss, and when they do, the sound of bees swarming becomes audible, and Casey becomes sexually assertive, pushing him into their bedroom where they have sex for the first time, and it actually looks like it's going pretty well until the bug bite on her thigh pops, covering them both in goo, and she runs to the bathroom to clean herself up in shame and disgust. Considering the later rape reveal, I do feel like the bug bite here represents the way that carrying PTSD from a non-consensual encounter can ruin future encounters with people that you actually love, and results in you feeling disgusting and broken. So in retrospect, this is very sad, but Casey's sexual aggression also marks the way that her metamorphosis has begun to allow her to come out of her shell, take the things she wants, make her own decisions, and know herself better than before she was bug Casey. Casey hears the trilling of insects whenever she locks eyes with herself in the mirror, representing the noise of constant judgment and overthinking. It's only when Jared's mother lets himself into the apartment and begins to threaten the clearly unwell Casey with ruining Jared's marriage, despite the fact that Casey directly asks her for help during this exchange, that things take a turn. Casey kills Jared's mother and then screams into the mirror, shattering it and representing the expulsion of the external noise that has made this commitment feel so disorienting. When Jared shows up to her apartment, she barricades the door and tells him that she needs time to think, finally finding the strength to call off the engagement only now that the hypercritical voice of his mother has gone. Similar to Jane Prentiss, Casey's space is dictated by a landlord that she ends up killing and leeching off herself, as she used Jared's mother's body as an egg incubator. Casey's metamorphosis progresses in line with her building confidence, self-esteem, and empowerment. Her hair falls out and her skin begins to slough off, which seems like it should horrify her, but instead represents the way that everything unimportant is falling away. Her apartment is filled with eggs and slime that she nurtures, overlapping with the hive motif slightly in this subversion of motherhood, but without actually carrying them in her body, which separates her from the trope. It also lends itself to her fears and reluctance towards motherhood. She does become a mother of sorts, birthing and watching her eggs, standing vigil, and while she doesn't like it, she doesn't hate it either. The eggs isolate her from her friends and family, as being postnatal can do, but it also gives her time to think and readjust her priorities. Casey discovers other abilities. She can vomit acidic slime on people, causing their skin to burn away in seconds. She covers her friend Kirsten's mouth with her hands and finds that large pores in her palm release a blue slime that glues her mouth and nose shut, suffocating her. When she overhears Jared and Jill having sex in the car, Casey screams a supersonic scream that causes them both to vomit. She covers her apartment in webs, making her domestic space into a nest. Casey's fingertips turn into chitin, allowing her to slash open the traitorous Jill's neck after forcing her to come clean about how she stood by and allowed Casey to be assaulted on her hen party. As the movie crescendos, Casey removes the hoodie she wore to hide her body and walks around, proud and naked, representing total self-acceptance. And it is now that she realizes that she did love Jared and did want to marry him, but this is kind of where the story falls apart. So she punishes Jill for her transgressions by killing her, but then deals worse to Jared after getting him to promise to help her. Her murder spree ends in a fight that sees her fiancé stab her to death and run away, infected with eggs that grow inside his living body until he is found by the police a week later. A metamorphosis victim often finds a twisted sense of empowerment at the cost of becoming monstrous. The metamorphosis victim becomes physically undesirable, ugly, and their body corrupts in such a way that they become incompatible with conventional womanhood and reproduction. Like, Casey loses all of her skin and hair, she begins to resemble a bold, flayed man, she sheds her softness, and her body produces a kind of armour that shields her against the stresses and miseries of the world, allows her to take a step back, and, for the first time in her life, figure out who she really is and what she really wants. Obviously, this is at the expense of her life at the end of the story, as it so often is. The metamorphosis also allows the reclamation of autonomy. She kills the landlady and her friend Jill, who are two women whose selfish desires have led them to sabotage her and actively try to ruin her life. It creates a body that is incompatible with modern beauty standards, a body that would be rejected by society, and therefore a body that has absolutely no need to worry about florist arrangements and wedding favours. It's an autonomy that allows her to say, hey, I need some time to get my head straight, to her fiancé, and actually mean it, and say things that she has always been too scared to say. It also gives her an anatomy that allows her to escape the responsibilities of conventional adult motherhood by having a body that produces insect eggs orally. Childbirth becomes like a daily vomit that Casey adjusts to pretty quickly, and then it's just a matter of supervising the eggs. Easy. Curiously, although Casey has thousands of eggs in her apartment, none of them hatch. Only the eggs that she later implants into Jared hatch, in a disgustingly tragic ending for the both of them, implying that perhaps she isn't able to actually reproduce asexually and still needs a male to, like, fertilize them, which flips the roles, since it gives him the responsibility of carrying and birthing the children, which is a thing that Casey was always terrified of being saddled with, because he's so busy at work all the time, she would be doing it 100% alone. While Woman as Hive depicts women who become saddled with a hellish version of motherhood responsibilities, the purest form of childbirth and incubation, Woman as Bug allows them to step outside of those responsibilities and emancipate themselves from gender roles at the cost of their beauty and eventually their lives. Next on our list of metamorphoses are Mary and Maria from Silent Hill 2, who many of you will already know don't actually turn into moths or butterflies, but whose journeys are heavily associated with that kind of rebirth metamorphosis, to the point where they actually spawned my idea for this video. So I've talked about Mary extensively in my videos on Silent Hill 2, and you'll know my opinion on James if you've watched them, but Mary is a tragic character. She has an unnamed terminal disease that leaves her bedridden and suffering in hospital for 3 years, experiencing hair loss, horrible rashes, and constant chronic pain due to a lack of treatment. She loses her beautiful looks, and by her early 20s, she loses any hope for a future and a family with her husband. Mary spends a lot of her final days angry and insecure. We can listen to one particular moment towards the end of the game, just before James encounters her on the roof of the hotel they stayed in and fights her as the final boss, and the speech goes like this.
What do you want, James?
I brought you some flowers.
Flowers? I don't want any damn flowers. Just go home already.
Mary, what are you saying?
Look, I'm disgusting. I don't deserve flowers. Between the disease and the drugs, I look like a monster. Well, what are you looking at? Get the hell out of here! Leave me alone already! I'm no use to anyone. I'll be dead soon anyway. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. It'd be easier if they'd just kill me. But I guess the hospital is making a nice profit off me. They want to keep me alive. Are you still here? I told you to go. Are you deaf? Don't come back. James, wait. Please don't go. Stay with me. Don't leave me alone. I didn't mean what I said. Please, James. Tell me I'll be okay. Tell me I'm not going to die. Help me.
James decides to kill Mary only once she has returned home to live out her final few days in peace. Literally, they're on the home stretch. She's got hours left on the clock. After 3 years of watching his wife suffer with a terminal illness, James's act of killing her, to me, reads more as the deliberate action of a man who cares more about getting the last word in and exerting power over a situation that has left him feeling powerless than it is about bringing his wife any actual peace. But we've covered it, and I won't belabor it here. But more to the point, Mary's speech in that corridor is a speech many fans of the game will use as evidence to suggest that Mary deserved to die, wanted to die, and/or was actually so abusive to James that she was the secret villain all along, when in reality, this speech demonstrates the frustration and misery of a woman trapped in the space between life and death. Mary's insecurities revolve around how she's of no use to anybody, and how she looks like a monster. She lashes out because she wants comfort and reassurance, because she is looking into the eyes of a man who will soon be free of her, and perhaps it feels easier for her to reframe that freedom as something she permits in advance. Mary is trapped on the fringe of patriarchal desire. She was once a beautiful woman with a loving husband and a whole future ahead of her, a future that undoubtedly involved children. Mary's future as housewife and mother has been stolen from her. Her body is ravaged by disease, and her husband's role has changed. He is now, in sickness and death, forced to wait that sickness out before he can be free to start his life again. Mary grieves not only her life, but her role within society as a mother and a wife. James kills Mary and then drives to Silent Hill, the place where they were last happy together, and depending on some fan theories, the place where Mary caught the sickness in the first place. And as confirmed by Masahiro Ito, he drives there with Mary's corpse on the back seat. And as soon as we get to the first proper location in the game, the Woodside Apartments, the parallels with moths begin to appear. Moths, particularly the Death's Head moths, are associated with death. Especially in the remake, we see Death's Head moths, Edacena hamada moths, dot moths, Tassar silk moths, pepper moths, black rustic moths, black geometrid moths, and Langsdorffia lunifera moths. A lot of moths, all of which represent the fact that Mary is dead. People often argue that Mary's parallel, Maria's butterfly tattoo, represents rebirth, which is true, but Mary's moths also represent rebirth. Both creatures do, because they both form chrysalises. Maria, to me, is purely representative of the more palatable form of the symbolism, the more attractive kind of rebirth. This is shown in the Woodside Apartments, where we find a room full of moths. Inside it is the audible sound of a photocopier, representing the way that Maria is being created as a perfect copy, born from a wish. But Maria isn't being reborn, she's just being born. Mary is the reborn character. Mary's physical appearance, whilst sick, is juxtaposed to moths as well. It's hard to find actual pictures of this online, since even the screenshots of the observation deck interior, where you start the game by staring mournfully at your reflection in the mirror, are not fully in focus, but they're actually smudged Bible quotes that the old Silent Hill forums spent a lot of time decoding back in 2009. Specifically, Job 13:28, which read, "While I am decaying like a rotten thing, like a garment that is moth-eaten, Mary is rashy and raw, because she is moth-eaten." Mary's suffering in the months before her death is twofold. She's not just grieving her life, nor simply wallowing in the pain and misery of an illness that cannot be treated, but she is grieving her purpose. She married young, she's already a housewife, she's sweet and loyal and dedicated, and she is forbidden the only thing that she considers to be valuable, her use. Her death frees her from that. It frees her from her marriage and her role within that marriage. It frees her from her socially prescribed purpose. It frees her from aging and the loss of youth, and it frees her from the expectations of childbirth and rearing. Now, I am not suggesting that Mary wanted to be free of those things. I got the impression that they suited her, and she clearly quite wanted them. It was a life that she enjoyed. The freedom wasn't something she wanted, but when she is reborn, all of those problems become secondary, and all that remains is rage. Mary's role as the final boss of Silent Hill 2 is as tragic as it is cathartic. She is able to lash out against a man who killed her and punish him for what he did and how he made her feel. She loved James, but she's also holding on to a lot of bitter, helpless rage. And while her final speeches to James are loving and compassionate and often forgiving, depending on which ending you get, her role as the final boss allows her the opportunity to essentially vent her anger and leave her mark on his life, to go down fighting, so to speak. Even if she forgives James, she naturally holds mixed emotions, and those are represented by her final form. Mary's symbolic rebirth as a moth allows her to live in darkness and filth, fly and summon moths to fight on her behalf. It grants her physical and emotional autonomy, the space to be angry, and the body and power to be angry with, even if she has no greater goal, since this ends in her death again. Mary, for the briefest moment, experiences a life of pure, selfish want as predator, not prey. The ecofeminism of woman as bug allows us to analyse the subjugation, exploitation, and demonisation of the feminine and the broader economy, as it evokes monstrous female power that draws on the traditional role of the Gothic in facilitating the male experience of fear and vulnerability with impunity. Essentially, Mary comes back looking the way she does to make James feel scared and vulnerable, the same way that she felt scared and vulnerable, and to have the last word, so to speak. She will not be remembered as his passive, helpless wife. Mary, a woman who was euthanized by her husband with a pillow, pursues him around a small room, hanging from a spiked bastardization of the bed frame she spent 3 years in, showering her husband in clouds of violent moths, stabbing him with a strange barb, and occasionally body slamming him. Her rebirth lasts a short period of time, and her metamorphosis into a moth is more symbolic than it is literal body horror, but she uses this time to exercise power and autonomy that she never had in life in a society that prized her for her beauty, youth, and fertility. And finally, on the Brenda to Beldam scale, I knew I'd think of something. We have the other mother from Coraline. The other mother is sitting at the most extreme end of this scale because her metamorphosis is so final that her transformation is into a human, not vice versa. Coraline, the movie specifically, is a story about a young girl who moves with her parents from Pontiac, Michigan to Ashland, Oregon, living in a house that's been carved into 3 apartments by its original owner, Mrs. Lovat. Mrs. Lovat no longer lives on the property. Several child disappearances were recorded in that house over the years, including that of her sister, and those disappearances were preceded by the appearance of a doll made to look like the victim. We see the construction of this doll during the opening credits. The way the old doll, Mrs. Lovat's sister's doll, floats in through the window, is undone and remade, and then sent back out again like a message in a bottle. The doll acts as a lure to draw children into the Beldam's web, a totemistic palantir through which the Beldam manipulates its prey. Often, when Coraline's doll is visible in scenes, she will have her head turned to Coraline as though observing her, acting like a security camera for the Beldam. Bugs are a running motif across the story. Coraline's parents are gardeners and writers, meaning they spend plenty of time in the mud. The 150-year-old house they live in, and remember what we said about Gothic horror and houses, has a bathroom full of worms that Coraline squishes to the distended sounds of squeaky violins. Coraline's bedside photo frame is in the shape of a praying mantis. She wears a dragonfly hair clip and has paper dragonflies on string dangling around her bed frame like fairy lights. Local child Wybie hunts for banana slugs in the fog. Bugs are everywhere in Coraline, and they represent normality. They represent the balance that Coraline and her family share with the wider environment. But it also represents their role as prey. Bugs are everywhere, except spiders, because the spider in the story is hunting Coraline and the other insects. Coraline is depicted as being amongst her fellow insects, and by extension she joins their food chain. On Coraline's first night in the house, the tiny door in the wall upstairs opens, releasing a bundle of mice that look more like strands of web that come upstairs to lure her to the Beldam's realm. The Beldam, or the other mother, as she introduces herself to Coraline, has a realm that is a warm, inviting version of the apartment complex she lives in, called Pink Palace. palace, where your favourite food is always served and everyone has time to play with you. It unspools for Coraline slowly, staircasing the fun so as not to overwhelm her, and always leaves her wanting more. It also has a definitive horizon. If you walk too far in one direction, you're soon walking on white canvas, because there's no need to have an outer world beyond the web. The realm contains two entities that introduce themselves as Coraline's other mother and other father, who appear like Coraline's loved ones, only their eyes are replaced with buttons. The other mother lowers Coraline's guard by doubling her mother. The doppelganger is a common feature in 19th to 20th century literature and very prevalent in Gothic fiction, because it is used to convey psychological and social anxiety. The doppelganger trope stipulates various societal norms around the construction of femininity. Through fashion, appearance, and masquerade, female doubling extends a rhetoric of what women should be according to patriarchal discourse, juxtaposing skewed femininity against the social norm, often functioning in stories as ways to consume the real woman with the double. Basically, the other mother depicts a facade of perfect motherhood, pretending to be everything the fantasy mother should be. She cooks a delicious meal for Coraline on her first night, whereas Coraline's actual mother is too tired from the move and too busy with work to make a proper meal, and her real father cooks instead, this lardy vegetable jelly slop. Other father makes flirty jokes about other mother's blessed golden chicken breast, and she waves him away with a flattered but restrained smile. She cooks in a full glam outfit with a beautiful red apron and perfectly done hair, making no mess in the warmly lit kitchen. She hand sews Coraline a beautiful outfit, including shoes. The other mother knows an effective home remedy for curing the poison oak that Coraline's real mother isn't particularly sympathetic about. The other mother knows and prioritizes Coraline's happiness over all things. She makes other father build the garden in Coraline's image, and he says she knows you like the back of her hand. Like real mother probably does, but doesn't have the magical resources to compete. Real mother actually locks the door to the Beldam's realm without even realizing, attributing it to rat crap, and saying that she thought it might make Coraline feel safer, but could be reflective of having a proper mothering instinct. This perfection is shown to hide a monstrous reality, and perhaps can only exist within a monstrous context, because to maintain this perfection as a perpetual staircase of fun would be impossible. Coraline suggests that consistently perfect motherhood is impossible to achieve, outside of the subterfuge required to lure in children. It's a brittle shell that hides a terrifying reality. The other mother also doesn't eat when Coraline eats. Firstly, to demonstrate that the Beldam is not hungry for food. Her meal is sitting at the table in front of her, and secondly to mimic the way that mothers will sometimes cook when the children are hungry but when they're not, and will still sit at the table with you anyway while you eat, or in sadder cases only have the food to feed one of you and will prioritise the children. It also echoes the way that adult women are expected to maintain their figure after having children, and many do so by skipping meals. The gesture is self-sacrificial and evokes restraint. The other mother presents Coraline with a cake that reads, "Welcome home," demonstrating a magical mastery of the domestic sphere. The perfect mother is a performance put on by a predator, the only cracks showing being the ones of her drumming her nails on the table. Her later outfit begins to take on that appearance of like the big booty thing you see on bugs where the wings go back, you know what I mean, like the back end of a firefly or a praying mantis. Yeah, her outfits kind of start to show those cracks. Bugs are a motif in the Beldam's realm too. The first thing Coraline hears upon her arrival is the chirping of crickets. In her other bedroom, paper dragonflies flutter around and say hello. Other father drives an enormous mechanical grasshopper, or cricket? I don't know. Anyway, the other father is nothing but a thrall, a smaller, subordinate entity to the Beldam who is only allowed to eat when Coraline eats, and otherwise acts as a clown to delight her. Towards the midpoint of the film, we find that he can't even speak when mother isn't present. Once Coraline has been sucked in enough, the other mother offers to let her stay in her realm forever. All she has to do is agree to have her eyes sewed with buttons. Coraline is obviously repulsed, and after she initially rejects the offer, she finds that she can't leave the realm. A cat explains the situation to her, and then she walks back into the Beldam's living room to find it a bug fest. Bug-themed furniture and wallpaper, most of it sentient, and she offers Coraline some living cocoa beetles, which she crunches down on with bliss. People get really annoyed at Coraline for being bratty and mean-tempered, but let's be real, it's the only thing that allows her to withstand the pressure applied by the other mother, especially when children are raised to be polite in other people's homes and to be grateful for things that are done for them. The Beldam makes a very foolish wager with Coraline, who isn't about to let things like the social contract get in the way of what she wants. Coraline refuses and refuses until the Beldam gets angry enough to transform into something a little closer to her true form, long and spindly and full of angles. Other Wybie reveals himself and the other constructs to be made of web, temporary and powdery, able to dry out and blow away as dust. Other Father turns into a pumpkin and becomes lethargic and lumbering, similar to the pumpkin of Cinderella, which is turned into a carriage but has to turn back at midnight. The Beldam demonstrates the ability to revoke the maternity and paternity of Coraline's parents when she won't acquiesce to her offer, trapping them in her world with her. This demonstrates that she could probably target adults, but chooses not to. In a simple but impactful scene, Coraline collects and shapes pillows like her parents and lies between them, reflecting that true motherhood is presence and stability. It's not about having 500 desserts, it's just about being there. The other mother continues to sing and cook delicious breakfasts, even in her monstrous form, and Coraline challenges her to a game, the prize being freedom. Coraline wanders through a savage version of her dream home, accosted by hummingbirds that swarm like bees and steal her things. She encounters other Father, who is being puppeted into attacking Coraline on the back of that mantis thingy, and when he is dragged down into the pond below the bridge, he gives her the eye willingly. The Beldam's mistreatment of her subordinates has destroyed any loyalty they might feel, which causes her own end. The domestic sphere is all that exists. Literally, they're in a snow globe-shaped area and the distant scenery is like wallpaper. When Coraline finds the Beldam's other captives, the domestic sphere unravels. All of the insect furniture becomes decrepit and rusty and can barely move. The Beldam's full final form is shown, a body of bone and chitin, with metal fingers like spider legs and long mantis legs that peek out of her dress like wire. When Coraline throws a cat at her, not a euphemism, the Beldam yanks out the floor and reveals an enormous web that she clambers around on like a spider, using its vibrations to find Coraline as she struggles to climb away. When Coraline gets back through the little door, she crawls back up the length of the papery hive tunnel as the Beldam screams at her, "Don't leave me," drawing on maternal manipulation. The other mother is a full insect-human transforming hybrid, with emphasis on the insect, and this transformation allows her, or even requires her, to live outside of society. The Beldam performs social constraints to lower the guard of her victims, but broadly speaking, doesn't need them. She is free of them. So the other mother is empowered, but only in the sense that empowerment isn't always used for good. She is empowered to be evil, and this is shown by the fact that the other mother lives in her own entirely fabricated reality, sources her own food, and uses her own magic to achieve what she wants. Her bugness affords her power and autonomy at the cost of her beauty. By the end, she is truly monstrous, and the facade of perfect motherhood is gone. The other mother is, to us, an evil creature. She has a web, children crawl into it, she brings them in close, she has them make a spiritual contract, and then she traps them with her, slowly feasting on their souls over a period of decades and centuries. Deliberately targeting children, the Beldam is a total inversion of maternity and a true predator. As an inversion of womanhood and motherhood, her hostility towards children sets her in opposition to every standard for motherhood we have, and further perverts her role within the story. Her constant juxtapositions with the real mother, Coraline's real mother, creates a lot of parallels between the Beldam's constantly satisfying, frictionless world and the less colourful but more real reality that Coraline lives in. Her parents are funny, they love her, they want to spend time with her, they make sure that she takes her daily multivitamins, they crack jokes, but they're busy humans. The Beldam mirrors back to Coraline what she expects from her parents, the ideal motherhood, as per children's expectations. But it is a flimsy and short-term facade intended purely to deceive. Unlike the colonized ostracization of the hive, the extreme end of metamorphosis bears no such motifs. The Beldam isn't interested in joining or assimilating with a society of humans. Rather, she lives on the fringes, outside of society, and feeds on stragglers like a parasite. Unlike the hive, the metamorphosis has more empowering connotations, even if that empowerment is used for evil. Women who become insects in horror might look disgusting, but it allows them to step outside of a life where they lack control, shed their softness and the expectations of conventional beauty, reclaim their autonomy, and become predators rather than prey. Becoming bug often allows female characters to escape things, like motherhood and childbirth, by offloading them to a subordinate male, subverting the trope of the hive entirely, and escape abuse by turning back on their tormentors and physically fighting back. It allows them to produce and maintain their own space, like a nest or a web of sorts that lures victims in on its own, a territory that they can defend and hunt within, for better or worse, and a space that is entirely their own. Becoming bug women are often exceptionally strong and powerful, removing their fear of being overpowered by men and allowing them to operate without fear in dangerous places and situations, so that they might face their fears and oppressors head on. It also allows them to be ugly, monstrously tall, skeletal, flayed, hairless, gaunt, diseased, and filthy. Their appearances are so extreme that they cause their stark and immediate ostracization from patriarchy, jettisoned into an outside space where looks simply no longer matter. And with that freedom, they are able to align their priorities with more important things. Women becoming bug have a much greater clarity of thought, pursue their goals single-mindedly, and because this is horror, serve as some of the angriest antagonists in horror history. All in all, the demarcation between the hive and the metamorphosis is simple. Does the individual carry young within their body? If yes, they're the hive. If not, they are the metamorphosis. Although entities like Jane Prentiss straddle the gap, every woman as bug will have that one defining feature, and the tropes and associations with corruption and motherhood and autonomy often follow in full and predictable swing. The Brenda Beldam spectrum never fails, is all I can say. As with many things in horror, female-centered horror often feels like it's still in a sort of infancy in many ways, due to the fact that a lot of horror focuses on women through a male lens. The hive depicts a fear of being used as a breeding cow. The metamorphosis depicts a fear of being too ugly to be allowed to be part of society, which are fears that women experience, but ultimately they're quite male-centered fears that don't expand much beyond imagine if you were too fertile to be allowed your own autonomy, or imagine if you were too ugly to be useful. Still, as horror evolves and the depiction of women in horror stretches to new and previously uncharted places, I am pretty excited to see how women as bug continues, whether it fades away as all of its avenues are explored, or whether it will evolve into things we never previously considered. I wanted to make this video for a while, but for some reason I find it harder to sit through a 90-minute movie taking notes than I find it to work an 8-hour shift, so I kept procrastinating on this for a long time until I finally sat down and decided to get it done, and I enjoyed this format very much. It felt kind of like writing 6 mini essays in one instead of like one massive essay, which was good practice and kept the momentum going. I'm sorry, you literally didn't ask, but you know, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.